Hey guys! Okay, so some of you have already dived into cellular respiration and cellular metabolism, and you're probably like, oh my goodness, this is very complicated. Well, cellular respiration can be very complicated, and if you were taking a majors level course, we would get into all the nitty-gritty, all the chemicals, all the cycles and changes. We're going to give you an overview because this is non-majors biology. We don't want to get too detailed. We want to understand the big picture of things. So the big picture is we're all connected. What animals, including humans, do to utilize oxygen and break down glucose, break down our food to get the energy we need to do all the things we do in our body, well, what we spit out from as a result of that process are the same things the plants want to take in. And they use what we breathe out, they take it in, and they rearrange it using the sun into food, into glucose. The same stuff we eat, or we eat things that ate the things from the plants. So in other words, it's kind of like cycle of life, like the Lion King, right? So photosynthesis produces glucose, C6H12O6, sugar, and oxygen. So how many of you knew that plants breathe out oxygen and they breathe in carbon dioxide? We animals, we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. Works very, very well, right? So plants produce glucose and oxygen and take in carbon dioxide and water. We animals take in the glucose and oxygen and spit out carbon dioxide and water. So inside of our cells, we're going to undergo different metabolic reactions that are ultimately going to produce the energy we need to break down glucose, utilizing oxygen, and spitting out carbon dioxide and water. So for plants, their energy source is the sun. For us, we can produce the molecule ATP, which is our energy currency. And so we can do that in two ways, and we're going to learn about those ways in a very brief overview. Okay, so for us, this is called cellular respiration. And I mentioned that there's two ways that we can undergo this. One is through what's called aerobic respiration. Now, aerobic respiration requires oxygen. That's what aerobic means. We have to have oxygen to undergo it. And aerobic respiration is going to take place in the mitochondria of the cells. So you remember the mitochondria, those little pill-shaped guys? There are energy powerhouses that because they produce ATP, and they do it through a process called cellular aerobic respiration. Now, we don't have to use aerobic respiration for everything. We can take a shortcut by using what's called anaerobic respiration. This is respiration of our cells that does not require oxygen. And you might know that yeast undergo one kind of anaerobic respiration called yeast fermentation. And that might be very important to you because we use that in making beer, in making bread, things like that. So if you're in the lab course, you've probably done your yeast fermentation lab where we add a sugar source, aka like sucrose, for example, that contains glucose, and the yeast will break down that sugar and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide as byproducts. The alcohol gets used in wonderful beverages like beer, and the carbon dioxide produces the bubbles inside the beer. Or if you make bread, the yeast break down the sugars inside the flour, and the carbon dioxide fills up the little holes inside the dough and causes the bread to rise. So right here you see an overview of yeast fermentation. So you get a molecule of glucose, and through this process called glycolysis, it will produce an intermediate molecule called pyruvate that has 3 carbons. Here's another intermediate, acetaldehyde. But the more important thing is the take-home message, ethanol, alcohol. Very important part of beer making. Well, in the process of doing all this mumbo-jumbo here, we're going to generate a net of 2 ATP molecules, 2 molecules of energy that are going to fuel life's processes. But that's not a lot. You know, 2 ATPs, it helps, but it's not enough to do everything a multicellular creature like us needs to do. So we're going to need to combine that with a process that will produce more ATPs. But anyway, this is yeast fermentation. Animals don't undergo yeast fermentation, but we do something similar, and that's called glycolysis. And so glycolysis, we specifically are going to do more of this path right here. This is called the lactic acid fermentation pathway. So we take a molecule of glucose, and through glycolysis, we also have an intermediate of pyruvate, and we're going to spit out some lactate. So this will convert into lactic acid. So if you've ever, for example, lifted weights and you get really sore the next day, it's because of the buildup of lactic acid from the glycolysis pathway here. So anyway, the take-home message here is glycolysis only produces a net of 2 ATPs, not a lot of energy. We require oxygen to undergo aerobic respiration inside the mitochondria, and that will produce us a net of 36 ATPs, which is much nicer for every one glucose molecule we eat. So glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. Aerobic respiration happens inside the mitochondria. Okay, and let's kind of just go over this again. So the first thing we always do is glycolysis. It happens in the cytoplasm. One molecule of glucose that we got from our food is converted to a 3-carbon molecule called pyruvate. So here it is, glucose being converted to pyruvate. And in the process, we produce a net of 2 ATP. We actually produce 4 ATP, but it costs 2 to do the process in the first place, so you end up with 2 ATP left over. Well, that pyruvate gets converted to carbon dioxide, okay, and that carbon dioxide is obviously what we breathe out, and the plants breathe in. And in the process, we're going to get some free hydrogen ions, and those hydrogen ions are going to fuel the electron transport chain later on in the process. But again, the important thing is glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm of the cell, produces a net of 2 ATP and an intermediate pyruvate, but carbon dioxide is given off as a waste product, which we eventually breathe out. It gets in our circulatory system, goes back to the lungs, and out our mouth or nose it goes. Okay, so that's what happens outside of the mitochondria. Let's take a deeper look at what happens inside the mitochondria. And so this is where we're going to generate the most energy, the most ATP. So first thing that happens is the pyruvate that was produced during glycolysis enters the mitochondria, and you're going to have a pathway that produces a chemical called acetyl coenzyme A. Acetyl coenzyme A. And the products that come from this process are going to fuel a cycle called the citric acid cycle, or it's also called the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle by itself, through a complex biochemical pathway with lots of chemicals involved that you don't need to worry about right now, when that cycle is done, you're going to get a net 2 ATP out of that. So now we have 2 plus 2, so we're up to 4 ATPs. But where we're going to get the most ATPs is through what's called the electron transport chain. And so you might remember those free hydrogen ions that were produced from glycolysis are going to fuel this electron transport chain. And again, I'm not going to get into the details of what's involved in the electron transport chain. It's quite complicated, but just know that the product of this electron transport chain is going to be 32 ATP. So when we take the 32 ATP from the electron transport chain, the 2 from the Krebs cycle, and the 2 from glycolysis, we end up with a net 36 ATP of energy for every 1 molecule of glucose. In a nutshell, that means we're very efficient. We multicellular eukaryotic organisms are very good at using that 1 molecule of glucose and getting a lot of energy out of it. And it's thanks to the mitochondrion. So you might have remembered from the previous lecture me talking about the theory of endosymbiosis and how they think that originally mitochondria were bacterial cells that get engulfed by a phagocytizing larger cell, and that instead of digesting that bacterial cell escaped digestion and took up residency inside that larger cell. And the larger cell benefited by the presence of those bacteria because they were starting to get extra energy from them in the form of ATP. And that allowed this bigger cell to do more things, do more metabolic functions, grow larger, et cetera, So the host cell benefited by the presence of the bacteria, by being able to utilize more energy, getting more energy out of it. And of course, the bacterial cell benefited by having a nice safe home and genetic material from the host cell. So they formed a mutualistic symbiosis, and hence we had the evolution of those bacterial cells evolving into mitochondria. So that's the theory of endosymbiosis. Okay, so again, just real quick sum up. Glycolysis is an anaerobic process, does not require oxygen, but for every 1 molecule of glucose, you spit out 2 ATPs, and you're producing an intermediate called pyruvate, which is a 3-carbon molecule. That molecule is going to enter the mitochondria, where it is going to produce acetyl coenzyme A and fuel a cycle called the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. And that cycle spits out 2 ATP, and the hydrogen ions from glycolysis fuel the electron transport chain, which will also produce a ATP, but a whole lot of it, 32 ATP for every 1 molecule of glucose. So through the whole process of anaerobic plus aerobic cellular respiration, we end up with a net of 36 ATPs. And that's a wrap. See you soon.